The rain was hammering against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Meridian Tower as I sat in my corner office on the 32nd floor, staring at the resignation letter I'd been rewriting for the third time that week. After 8 years of building the marketing department from a 2-person team into the company's most profitable division, I never imagined it would end like this. But sometimes the people closest to power can make your life hell. And Daniel Harrison's adopted son Marcus was about to learn that lesson the hard way. My name is Sarah Chun, and I've been the director of marketing at Harrison Industries for nearly a decade. What started as my dream job in downtown Seattle had slowly transformed into a nightmare, all because of one person who seemed determined to push me out of the company his father had built from nothing. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just about workplace politics or corporate drama. It's about what happens when privilege meets reality, when family loyalty collides with professional integrity, and when someone who's never truly experienced being an outsider decides to make others feel like they don't belong. It's about the moment when I realized that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away, even when walking away means leaving behind everything you've worked for. If you're enjoying this story of workplace drama and family dynamics, please subscribe to our channel to help us bring you more real stories like this one, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Your support means everything to us as we continue sharing these authentic experiences. The tension had been building for months, ever since Marcus Harrison joined the company as Vice President of Operations 6 months ago. At 28, he was fresh out of his MBA program at Wharton, armed with theories and an attitude that made it clear he viewed anyone who'd been at the company longer than him as dead weight. But it wasn't just his arrogance that bothered me. It was the way he systematically tried to undermine my authority, questioning my decisions in front of my team, suggesting that my methods were outdated, and worst of all, constantly referring to me as an outsider who didn't understand the company's vision. Marcus had a particular talent for making his attacks seem reasonable, even helpful. He would frame his criticism as constructive feedback, delivered with that practice smile he'd perfected in business school. During team meetings, he'd interrupt my presentations to suggest alternative approaches, always prefacing his comments with phrases like, "I think what Sarah is trying to say," or, "Building on Sarah's point, we might consider." To an outsider, it might have looked like collaboration. To me, it felt like death by 1,000 cuts. The worst part was watching how other people responded to his behavior. Some of my team members began second-guessing themselves, asking for his approval on decisions they'd never questioned before. Junior executives who had once sought my mentorship started gravitating toward Marcus, sensing that he might be the future of the company and wanting to position themselves accordingly. Even clients began asking about him in meetings, having heard from someone in the company that he was driving the strategic vision for the organization. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had been adopted by Daniel when he was 16, after spending years in foster care. Daniel had given him everything: a stable home, the best education money could buy, and now a fast-track position in the family business. Yet somehow I was the outsider. I was the one who didn't belong, despite having poured my heart and soul into this company since Marcus was still in high school. I learned about Marcus's background not from Daniel, who was always discreet about personal matters, but from pieces of conversations I'd overheard over the years and details that emerged during company social events. The story, as I understood it, was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Marcus had been removed from his birth family due to neglect and abuse when he was 7 years old. He'd spent nearly a decade bouncing between foster homes, never staying anywhere long enough to form lasting attachments or feel truly secure. Daniel had met Marcus through a mentorship program he'd supported for years, one that paired successful business leaders with teenagers aging out of the foster care system. What was supposed to be a temporary mentoring relationship had evolved into something much deeper when Daniel realized that Marcus had nowhere to go when he turned 18. The adoption process had been complex and emotional, but Daniel had been determined to give this brilliant, troubled young man the stability and opportunities he'd never had. In many ways, Marcus's success story was everything Daniel had hoped for when he first got involved with the mentorship program. Marcus had excelled in high school, earned a full scholarship to Columbia University, and graduated magna cum laude before attending Wharton Business School on another scholarship. He was intelligent, articulate, and driven in ways that suggested he would never take his opportunities for granted. But somewhere along the way, His determination to succeed had twisted into something darker, a need to prove his worth by diminishing others. I sometimes wondered if Marcus's behavior toward me stemmed from his own deep-seated insecurities about belonging. Perhaps having spent so many years as an actual outsider, he was now overcompensating by aggressively defending his position as an insider, even if it meant making others feel excluded in the process. But understanding the psychological roots of his behavior didn't make it any easier to endure, and it certainly didn't excuse the damage he was causing to me and other employees. The final straw came during what was supposed to be a celebration. Harrison Industries had just landed the biggest contract in company history, a $50 million deal with a major retail chain that would expand our presence across the entire West Coast. My marketing team had been instrumental in securing this partnership, working 18-hour days for 3 months to create a campaign that perfectly captured what the client was looking for. Daniel was so impressed that he decided to host an executive dinner at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, inviting all the department heads and their spouses to celebrate this milestone achievement. I arrived at the hotel that Thursday evening feeling genuinely excited for the first time in months. I'd worn my best navy blue dress, the one my sister always said made me look confident and professional, and I'd even splurged on getting my hair done at the salon downtown. The Fairmont's Georgian room was elegant and intimate, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over tables set with fine china and fresh orchids. The Seattle skyline glittered through the tall windows, and for a moment, I felt proud to be part of this success story. The evening had started perfectly. I'd arrived early enough to have a glass of wine and catch up with colleagues I hadn't seen much of during the intense weeks leading up to the contract signing. Janet Morrison, our CFO, was there with her husband, a gentle professor of literature at the University of Washington, who always made interesting conversation about the intersection of storytelling and business strategy. Tom Rodriguez, our head of operations before Marcus arrived, was celebrating his recent promotion to senior vice president, a move that had surprised everyone given Marcus's rapid ascent through the company ranks. As I moved through the cocktail reception, I was reminded of why I'd fallen in love with Harrison Industries in the first place. It wasn't just a company. It was a community of people who genuinely cared about each other's success and who had built something meaningful together. The conversations that evening were filled with genuine warmth and shared memories, from the early days when we all worked out of a converted warehouse in Georgetown to the recent expansion that had brought us to our gleaming downtown offices. Even Marcus seemed to be on his best behavior during the cocktail hour. He was charming and attentive, asking thoughtful questions about people's families and showing interest in projects outside his direct area of responsibility. I began to wonder if I'd been too harsh in my assessment of him, if perhaps the stress of his new role had been making him more competitive and defensive than he normally would be. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that this evening might mark a turning point in our relationship, that we might finally find a way to work together productively. Daniel Harrison was in his element that night, moving from table to table, sharing stories about the early days of the company and thanking everyone for their hard work. At 62, he was still an imposing figure, tall and distinguished with silver hair, and the kind of commanding presence that had built Harrison Industries from a small logistics company into a regional powerhouse. He'd always been fair to me, recognizing my contributions and trusting my judgment, even when others questioned his decision to promote a young Asian American woman to a senior leadership position. The trouble started during the appetizer course. Marcus had positioned himself at the table directly across from mine, flanked by 2 junior executives who hung on his every word like eager disciples. I was making conversation with Janet Morrison, our CFO, when I heard Marcus's voice rising above the gentle hum of dinner conversation. The seating arrangement wasn't accidental, I realized later. Marcus had specifically requested to be placed where he would have a clear view of me throughout the dinner, where every gesture and expression would be visible to the entire room. He'd been planning this moment, waiting for the perfect opportunity to make his statement in front of the entire leadership team and their families. The conversation at his table had started innocuously enough. Marcus was discussing the importance of strategic planning in today's rapidly changing business environment, drawing on case studies from his MBA coursework and examples from companies he'd researched during his job search. His voice carried that authoritative tone that had served him well in business school, confident and articulate in a way that commanded attention. But as the evening progressed, I noticed subtle changes in his demeanor. His gestures became more animated, his voice grew slightly louder, and his comments became more pointed. He began talking about the challenges facing companies that relied too heavily on legacy thinking, about the need to embrace new perspectives and move beyond outdated approaches that might have worked in the past but were no longer sufficient for future success. He was telling a story about his recent trip to New York, where he'd attended a conference on digital transformation in business. But as he spoke, his eyes kept drifting to me, and I could sense that this wasn't just casual conversation. He was building up to something, and I had a sinking feeling that I was about to become the target of whatever point he was trying to make. Marcus had always been handsome in that privileged, prep school way that opened doors and won over clients. His sandy brown hair was perfectly styled, his suit was clearly tailored, and he had the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having to worry about money or acceptance. But there was something cold in his blue eyes, something that suggested he enjoyed having power over people and wasn't afraid to use it. The moment I'd been dreading came during the main course. Daniel had just finished giving an impromptu speech about the importance of innovation and teamwork, and several people around the room had raised their glasses in appreciation. That's when Marcus decided to offer his own perspective on the company's success. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor in a way that drew everyone's attention. The conversations around the room gradually died down as people turned to listen to what the boss's son had to say. Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes, and I felt my stomach clench with anxiety. Marcus began by congratulating the team on the recent contract win, his voice smooth and confident as he acknowledged the hard work that had gone into securing the deal. But then his tone shifted, becoming more serious as he talked about the challenges facing the company in an increasingly competitive market. He spoke about the need for fresh perspectives and new approaches, about how some people in the organization were stuck in old ways of thinking that could hold the company back. As he spoke, I noticed that his gaze kept returning to me, and I realized with growing horror that this wasn't a general commentary on business strategy. This was a calculated attack, delivered with the kind of subtle cruelty that Marcus had perfected over the past 6 months. He was positioning himself as the voice of innovation and progress, while implying that others, particularly those who had been with the company for a long time, were obstacles to be overcome. The room had grown uncomfortably quiet, and I could feel the weight of everyone's attention as Marcus continued his speech. Janet Morrison shifted uneasily in her seat beside me, and I caught her shooting concerned glances in my direction. Even some of the junior executives who usually laughed at Marcus's jokes looked uncomfortable, sensing that something was happening but not quite understanding what it was. Then Marcus delivered the blow that would change everything. He raised his glass and proposed a toast to the future of Harrison Industries, to the people who truly understood the company's vision and weren't afraid to embrace change. And then, looking directly at me with that cold smile, he added the words that would echo in my mind for days to come. He said that while some people at the company might always feel like outsiders, never quite grasping what it truly meant to be part of the Harrison Industries family, the future belonged to those who were committed to growth and weren't held back by outdated thinking or personal limitations. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger as the implication became clear to everyone in the room. The phrase outsiders hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and I could feel the collective intake of breath from the people around me. Marcus had chosen his words carefully, using language that was just vague enough to provide plausible deniability while making his target unmistakably clear. To anyone who had been following the tension between us over the past months, there was no question about who he was referring to. What made the attack even more devastating was the way Marcus delivered it. His tone remained pleasant and conversational, his smile never wavered, and his body language suggested that he was simply sharing some thoughtful observations about business strategy. To someone who didn't know the context, it might have sounded like generic corporate rhetoric. But to me, and to everyone else in that room who understood the subtext, it was a calculated and public humiliation designed to undermine my credibility and position within the company. I felt my hands begin to shake as the full impact of what had just happened began to sink in. This wasn't just a professional disagreement or a clash of management styles. This was character assassination, delivered with surgical precision in front of the most important people in the organization. Marcus hadn't just questioned my abilities or my approach to work. He had attacked my very right to belong, suggesting that I was fundamentally incapable of understanding what it meant to be part of the Harrison Industries family. Marcus wasn't just questioning my professional abilities. He was attacking my very belonging in the company, suggesting that because I wasn't part of his inner circle, because I wasn't family in the way that he was family, I could never really understand what the company was about. The cruel irony of being called an outsider by someone who had literally been an outsider until Daniel gave him a home wasn't lost on me. But it also made the attack even more painful. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the eyes of every person in that room on me, waiting to see how I would respond. Some looked sympathetic, others appeared confused, and a few seemed to be enjoying the drama. But it was Daniel's expression that cut me the deepest. He looked shocked and uncomfortable, clearly understanding what had just happened but seeming uncertain about how to handle the situation. The worst part was seeing how some people at the table began to shift uncomfortably in their chairs, suddenly finding their plates fascinating or reaching for their phones to check messages that couldn't possibly be urgent. It was the kind of awkward silence that follows a social catastrophe, when everyone knows that something terrible has just happened but no one knows how to respond appropriately. Janet Morrison, sitting beside me, reached over and placed her hand on my arm in a gesture of support that was both comforting and heartbreaking. Tom Rodriguez was staring at Marcus with unconcealed disgust, his jaw clenched in anger at what he'd just witnessed. Even some of the junior executives who had been laughing at Marcus's jokes earlier in the evening looked uncomfortable, finally understanding that they had just watched something that crossed the line from corporate politics into personal cruelty. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on anyone who knew the history. Here was Marcus, someone who had literally been an outsider for most of his life, using that very concept as a weapon against someone who had devoted nearly a decade to building the company his father loved. The lack of self-awareness was staggering, but it was also revealing in ways that Marcus probably didn't intend. I wanted to stand up and defend myself, to point out everything I'd accomplished for the company, to remind everyone in that room of the countless nights I'd worked late, the weekends I'd given up, the personal sacrifices I'd made to help Harrison Industries succeed. But I also knew that any response I gave would only make the situation worse, would only give Marcus more ammunition to use against me. So instead, I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. I stood up calmly, placed my napkin on the table, and walked out of the restaurant without saying a word. I could hear the murmur of voices starting up behind me as I left, but I didn't look back. I walked through the lobby of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel with my head held high. Even though my hands were shaking and my heart was pounding so hard, I thought everyone could hear it. The cool Seattle air hit my face as I stepped outside, and I realized I was crying. Not the dramatic, angry tears I might have expected, but quiet, disappointed tears for a dream job that had turned into something ugly and hostile. I stood there on the sidewalk for a moment, watching the late evening traffic flow past and feeling more alone than I had in years. That night, I went home to my Capitol Hill apartment and sat at my kitchen table until 3 in the morning, writing and rewriting the resignation letter that I'd been avoiding for weeks. But this time, I wasn't just explaining my decision to leave. I was documenting everything that had led to this moment, every instance of Marcus's unprofessional behavior, every attempt he'd made to undermine my authority and push me out of the company. My apartment felt different that night, somehow smaller and more confined than it had before. The framed photos on my walls, many of them from company events and celebrations over the years, seemed to mock me with their reminders of happier times when I'd felt valued and appreciated. The awards and recognition letters I'd received from clients and industry organizations felt meaningless in the face of what had just happened. I found myself thinking about all the late nights I'd spent in that same kitchen, working on presentations and proposals that had helped drive the company's growth. I remembered the excitement I'd felt when we'd landed our first major client, the pride that had filled me when Daniel had promoted me to director, the satisfaction of building a team that consistently exceeded expectations. All of those achievements felt tainted now, overshadowed by the realization that none of it had been enough to protect me from Marcus's campaign of professional destruction. As I wrote, I tried to maintain a professional tone, focusing on specific incidents and observable behaviors rather than emotions or personal grievances. But it was difficult to keep my anger and disappointment from bleeding through the formal language. This wasn't just about my career or my professional reputation. It was about the violation of trust that occurred when someone uses their position of privilege to systematically tear down another person's standing in an organization. I wrote about the time he'd contradicted my marketing strategy in front of the entire executive team, claiming that my approach was too conservative for the modern market, even though my track record spoke for itself. I described the meeting where he'd suggested that my position should be restructured to report to him, despite the fact that I had seniority and my department consistently outperformed his. I detailed the casual comments he'd made about my communication style, my leadership approach, and my understanding of the company culture, all delivered with that same condescending smile that suggested I should be grateful for his feedback. But most importantly, I wrote about what had happened at the dinner, about the public humiliation and the message it sent to every other employee in the company. I explained how Marcus's behavior wasn't just affecting me personally, but was creating a toxic work environment that could drive away other talented people and ultimately hurt the company that Daniel had worked so hard to build. As I wrote, I found myself thinking about my early days at Harrison Industries, when Daniel had taken a chance on a 26-year-old marketing coordinator with big ideas and even bigger ambitions. He'd been the one to promote me to manager after just 2 years, recognizing my potential when others saw only my youth and inexperience. He'd supported my decision to pursue an MBA part-time, even allowing me to adjust my work schedule to accommodate my evening classes. And when the previous marketing director left for a competitor, Daniel hadn't hesitated to offer me the position, despite the doubts expressed by some board members who thought I was too young and too different to lead such an important department. Daniel Harrison wasn't perfect, but he'd always been fair, and he'd built his company on the principle that success should be measured by results, not by background or connections. The fact that his own adopted son was now undermining those very principles was probably the most heartbreaking part of the entire situation. By the time I finished the letter, dawn was beginning to break over the Seattle skyline, painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this city in the first place. I printed out the letter, signed it by hand, and placed it in an envelope addressed to Daniel Harrison, CEO. But I didn't plan to simply leave it on his desk like a typical resignation letter. I had something else in mind. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual, even though I'd barely slept. The 32nd floor was quiet, with only the cleaning crew finishing up their overnight work and the security guard making his morning rounds. I nodded to James, the security guard who'd been with the company almost as long as I had, and made my way to my office to prepare for what I knew would be a difficult day. I had 3 meetings scheduled before lunch, including a presentation to a potential client that could bring in another major account for the company. Despite everything that had happened, despite the humiliation and the anger, I was determined to maintain my professionalism until the very end. I owed that much to my team, to Daniel, and to myself. The morning passed in a blur of phone calls, presentations, and the normal chaos of running a busy marketing department. My team seemed to sense that something was wrong, but they were too polite or too busy to ask direct questions. Sarah Kim, my assistant director and the person I'd been grooming to potentially take over my role, kept shooting concerned glances in my direction, but I deflected her questions with vague responses about being tired after the dinner. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed to be in an unusually good mood. I could hear him laughing loudly in his office, which was located just down the hall from mine, and I caught glimpses of him throughout the morning as he made his rounds through the building. He looked pleased with himself, like someone who had just won an important victory and was savoring the taste of triumph. Around 11:30, I received a call from Daniel's assistant asking if I could come to his office for a brief meeting. My heart started racing as I wondered if Marcus had already spoken to his father about the previous night, if he'd somehow managed to spin the story in his favor and paint me as the problem. But I knew that this was the perfect opportunity to present my case, to let Daniel read my resignation letter and understand exactly why I was leaving the company. Daniel's corner office was impressive, with panoramic views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains in the distance. The walls were lined with awards and photographs documenting the company's growth over the years, including several pictures of company events where I was prominently featured. Seeing those photos made my decision even more bittersweet, reminding me of all the good times and proud moments I'd experienced as part of the Harrison Industries team. Daniel looked up from his computer as I entered, and I could see the concern in his eyes. He gestured for me to take a seat in one of the leather chairs across from his desk, and I noticed that he looked tired, as if he hadn't slept well either. The events of the previous evening had clearly weighed on his mind, and I wondered how much he understood about the ongoing conflict between Marcus and me. Before Daniel could speak, I took the initiative. I pulled the resignation letter from my portfolio and placed it on his desk, explaining that I had something important I wanted him to read. I told him that I'd made a difficult decision about my future with the company, and I wanted him to understand my reasoning before I made any official announcements. Daniel looked surprised and concerned as he picked up the envelope, but he didn't hesitate to open it. I watched his face carefully as he read, noting how his expression changed from confusion to understanding to what looked like genuine anger as he absorbed the details of Marcus's behavior over the past 6 months. He took his time with the letter, occasionally looking up at me with questions in his eyes, but mostly focusing intently on every word I'd written. When he finished reading, Daniel set the letter down and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his silver hair in a gesture I'd seen him make many times when he was processing difficult information. The silence stretched between us for what felt like an eternity, but I resisted the urge to fill it with explanations or apologies. I'd said everything I needed to say in the letter, and now it was his turn to respond. Finally, Daniel spoke, and his voice was heavy with disappointment and regret. He thanked me for bringing these issues to his attention and apologized for not recognizing sooner what was happening. He admitted that he'd noticed tension between Marcus and some of the senior staff, but he'd attributed it to the normal adjustment period that comes with any new leadership transition. He'd had no idea that the situation had escalated to the point where one of his most valued employees felt compelled to leave the company. Daniel asked me to reconsider my decision, to give him time to address the situation and make the necessary changes to ensure a better working environment. He spoke about my value to the company, about the relationships I'd built with clients and the success I'd brought to the marketing department. He reminded me of the projects we'd discussed for the coming year, the expansion plans that relied on my expertise and leadership. But I could see in his eyes that he understood why I felt I had to leave. The damage had been done not just to my relationship with Marcus, but to my standing within the company. The public nature of the previous night's humiliation had made it impossible for me to continue working effectively in my current role, particularly with Marcus positioned as a rising star in the organization. I explained to Daniel that while I appreciated his offer to address the situation, I didn't see how the fundamental dynamic could change. Marcus was his son, his chosen successor, and any action Daniel took to protect me would inevitably be seen as favoritism or weakness. The other employees would be watching to see how he handled the conflict, and any resolution that favored me over Marcus would send mixed messages about the company's leadership structure. More importantly, I told Daniel I'd lost something essential in the process of this conflict. I'd lost my enthusiasm for the work, my confidence in my role, and my sense of belonging in the organization I'd helped to build. Those things couldn't be restored simply by reprimanding Marcus or restructuring reporting relationships. They would take time to rebuild, if they could be rebuilt at all, and I wasn't sure I had the emotional energy to invest in that process. Daniel listened to my explanation with the same careful attention he'd given to my resignation letter, nodding occasionally and asking thoughtful questions that showed he understood the complexity of the situation. He didn't try to minimize my concerns or offer easy solutions that wouldn't address the underlying problems. Instead, he acknowledged the validity of my feelings and the legitimacy of my decision, even though it was clearly causing him pain. As our conversation continued, I found myself thinking about the relationship Daniel had built with Marcus over the years. I knew from office conversations and company events that their bond went beyond the typical father-son relationship. Daniel had rescued Marcus from a difficult situation in foster care, had given him stability and opportunity when he needed it most. The pride Daniel felt in Marcus's accomplishments was genuine and deep, making the situation even more complicated and heartbreaking. I realized that Daniel was facing an impossible choice between his loyalty to his son and his recognition of the damage that son was causing to his company and employees. It was a choice that no parent should have to make, and no CEO should have to navigate. But it was also a choice that would define the future direction of Harrison Industries and determine what kind of leader Daniel truly was. Toward the end of our meeting, Daniel made a request that surprised me. He asked if I would be willing to delay my departure for 2 weeks, not to reconsider my decision, but to help him understand the full scope of the problems Marcus's behavior had created. He wanted to interview other employees, to get a complete picture of how the situation was affecting the entire organization, and he needed my help to identify the people who might be willing to speak honestly about their experiences. I agreed to his request, understanding that this was about more than just my individual situation. If Marcus's behavior was part of a pattern, if other employees were also feeling marginalized or undermined, then Daniel needed to know about it before the problems spread further through the organization. We scheduled follow-up meetings for the rest of the week, and I promised to provide him with a detailed transition plan that would ensure my departure wouldn't disrupt any ongoing projects or client relationships. As I prepared to leave Daniel's office, he stood up and walked around his desk to shake my hand. But instead of the formal handshake I expected, he placed both hands on my shoulders and looked me directly in the eyes. He told me that losing me was one of the biggest mistakes the company would ever make, and that he took full responsibility for allowing the situation to deteriorate to this point. His words meant more to me than he probably realized. For months, I'd been questioning my own perceptions, wondering if I was being too sensitive or reading too much into Marcus's behavior. Having Daniel validate my concerns and acknowledge the legitimacy of my complaints gave me a sense of closure and confirmation that my decision was the right one. The next 2 weeks were unlike anything I'd ever experienced in my professional career. Daniel proved to be as thorough in his investigation as he was in everything else he did. He conducted confidential interviews with more than a dozen employees, from senior executives to junior staff members, asking specific questions about their interactions with Marcus and their observations of his management style. What he discovered was both shocking and sadly predictable. Marcus's behavior toward me wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of conduct that had been affecting multiple employees across different departments. Several people reported feeling intimidated or belittled in meetings with Marcus, and a few had already started looking for jobs at other companies. The toxic atmosphere that Marcus had created was beginning to spread throughout the organization, threatening the collaborative culture that Daniel had worked so hard to establish. During this investigation period, Marcus seemed to sense that something was happening. His usual confidence appeared shaken, and I noticed him having several long, private conversations with Daniel behind closed doors. The easy arrogance that had characterized his behavior for months was replaced by a nervous energy that suggested he was beginning to understand the consequences of his actions. The resolution came on a Friday afternoon, 2 weeks after my meeting with Daniel. I was in my office, finishing up some final documentation for my transition, when Daniel asked to see me one more time. When I arrived at his office, I was surprised to find Marcus there as well, sitting in one of the chairs across from Daniel's desk with an expression I'd never seen before. He looked younger somehow, less sure of himself, and for the first time since I'd known him, he seemed genuinely uncomfortable. Daniel had prepared for this meeting as carefully as he approached every important business decision. He'd consulted with the company's legal team, reviewed HR policies, and developed a plan that he hoped would address the immediate problems while protecting the long-term interests of Harrison Industries. What he proposed was both fair and decisive, showing the kind of leadership that had built his company's reputation for integrity and employee satisfaction. Marcus would be taking an extended leave of absence from the company, effective immediately. During this time, he would be required to complete a comprehensive leadership development program that included training in conflict resolution, emotional intelligence, and inclusive management practices. He would also be working with an executive coach who specialized in helping leaders develop more effective interpersonal skills. Additionally, Marcus would be required to make formal apologies to every employee who had been affected by his behavior, acknowledging his mistakes and committing to different conduct in the future. These apologies would be documented and placed in his personnel file, serving as a record of both the problems that had occurred and his commitment to addressing them. Most importantly for me, Daniel offered to restructure the organizational chart to ensure that Marcus and I would not have overlapping responsibilities or reporting relationships when he returned to the company. He proposed creating two distinct divisions, with clear boundaries and independent authority structures, that would allow us both to contribute to the company's success without having to work directly together. But Daniel also made it clear that my resignation had been accepted, and that he understood why I felt I needed to make a fresh start somewhere else. He offered to provide outstanding references and letters of recommendation, and he promised to help me network with other companies in the Seattle business community. He also insisted on providing a severance package that was far more generous than anything required by my employment contract, describing it as recognition for my contributions to the company's success over the years. As Daniel outlined his plan, I watched Marcus's face carefully, trying to gauge his reaction to these developments. He looked genuinely remorseful, and when Daniel finished speaking, Marcus turned to me and offered an apology that seemed sincere and heartfelt. He admitted that his behavior had been unprofessional and hurtful, and he acknowledged that he'd allowed his insecurities and desire to prove himself to cloud his judgment and damage his relationships with colleagues. Marcus explained that he'd felt enormous pressure to live up to Daniel's expectations and to prove that he deserved his position in the company. He'd been so focused on establishing his authority and demonstrating his value that he'd lost sight of the collaborative principles that had made Harrison Industries successful. He particularly regretted the incident at the executive dinner, calling it a moment of poor judgment that he would regret for the rest of his career. While I appreciated Marcus's apology, I also realized that it came too late to change my decision. The damage to our professional relationship was too significant to repair, and my trust in his ability to treat me fairly and respectfully had been permanently undermined. More importantly, I'd already begun to envision a different future for myself, one that might offer new challenges and opportunities for growth that wouldn't be possible if I remained at Harrison Industries. My last day at the company was bittersweet. My team threw a farewell party in the conference room, complete with cake and speeches that brought tears to my eyes. Several clients called to express their regret about my departure and to wish me well in my future endeavors. Even some of the employees who had been friendly with Marcus made a point of stopping by my office to say goodbye and to tell me how much they'd enjoyed working with me. 3 months later, I received a call from Daniel Harrison. He was calling to let me know that I'd been right about the impact of toxic leadership on company culture. During Marcus's absence, employee satisfaction scores had improved dramatically, and several people who had been considering leaving the company had decided to stay. The marketing department, under Sarah Kim's capable leadership, was continuing to thrive and had even landed 2 new major accounts. Daniel also wanted to let me know that Marcus was making genuine progress in his leadership development program. The executive coach he was working with had helped him understand how his background in foster care had contributed to his need to prove himself and his tendency to view relationships through a lens of competition rather than collaboration. Marcus was learning to channel his ambition in more positive directions and to build others up rather than tearing them down. Most importantly, Daniel told me, Marcus had specifically asked him to convey a message to me. He wanted me to know that he was grateful for the lesson I'd taught him, even though it had come at such a high cost. He understood now that true leadership wasn't about asserting dominance or excluding others, but about creating an environment where everyone could contribute their best work and feel valued for their unique perspectives and experiences. As I listened to Daniel's update, I felt a mix of vindication and sadness. I was glad that my decision to speak up had ultimately led to positive changes at Harrison Industries, and I was genuinely happy to hear that Marcus was working to become a better leader. But I also couldn't help thinking about what might have been different if he'd been willing to listen and learn earlier, before his behavior had driven away someone who could have been a valuable ally and mentor. Today, I'm working as the Chief Marketing Officer for a growing technology company in Portland, Oregon. It's a role that offers new challenges and the opportunity to build something from the ground up, just as I did during my early years at Harrison Industries. My new colleagues respect my experience and value my input, and I've rediscovered the enthusiasm and passion for my work that I thought I'd lost forever. The move to Portland turned out to be exactly what I needed. The city's creative energy and entrepreneurial spirit provided the perfect environment for rebuilding my confidence and rediscovering my professional identity. My new company, a sustainable technology startup focused on renewable energy solutions, offered me the chance to apply my marketing expertise to a mission I truly believed in. The work was challenging and meaningful in ways that reminded me why I'd chosen this career path in the first place. More importantly, the culture at my new company was everything that Harrison Industries had once been but had lost during Marcus's tenure. Collaboration was genuine, not performative. Leadership was about empowering others, not diminishing them. Diversity of thought and experience was celebrated rather than viewed as a threat to established power structures. Working in this environment made me realize just how toxic the atmosphere at Harrison Industries had become, and how much energy I'd been spending just trying to survive rather than thrive. The experience with Marcus taught me valuable lessons about standing up for myself and recognizing when a situation has become untenable. It also reinforced my belief that true success in business comes not from tearing others down, but from building collaborative relationships based on mutual respect and shared goals. Sometimes the people we clash with the most are the ones who need to hear our message the most, even if they're not ready to listen when we first try to share it. But perhaps the most important lesson I learned was about the power of walking away with dignity and integrity intact. There's a difference between giving up and making a strategic decision to remove yourself from a toxic situation. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is refuse to participate in your own diminishment, even when staying and fighting might seem like the stronger choice. Looking back, I don't regret my decision to leave Harrison Industries, even though it was one of the most difficult choices I've ever had to make. Sometimes walking away from a situation that's no longer serving you is the most powerful thing you can do, both for yourself and for the people who are left behind to confront the problems you've helped to expose. In the end, my resignation letter didn't just document my reasons for leaving. It became a catalyst for positive change that benefited everyone involved, including the young man who had tried so hard to push me out that he forgot to examine his own need to belong. The story doesn't end with my departure, though. 6 months after I left Harrison Industries, I received an unexpected email from Marcus himself. He had completed his leadership development program and had returned to the company with a very different perspective on what it meant to be a leader. His email was thoughtful and introspective, acknowledging not just the specific ways he had treated me poorly, but the broader pattern of behavior that had driven away talented people and damaged the company culture. Marcus wrote about the work he had done with his executive coach, exploring how his own experiences of rejection and abandonment had shaped his approach to workplace relationships. He had come to understand that his attempts to establish dominance and exclude others were rooted in his own deep-seated fears of being rejected or abandoned again. The irony wasn't lost on him that in trying to protect himself from feeling like an outsider, he had made others feel exactly the way he had felt for most of his childhood. He also shared some surprising insights about the changes at Harrison Industries since his return. Daniel had implemented new policies around inclusive leadership and had made it clear that the company's values were non-negotiable, regardless of family relationships or executive status. Marcus was working under much closer supervision, with regular feedback sessions and clear expectations about how he was expected to treat colleagues and subordinates. Most importantly, Marcus had become an advocate for the kind of workplace culture that I had always tried to promote. He was using his position and his relationship with Daniel to champion initiatives around mentorship, professional development, and creating opportunities for people from diverse backgrounds. In some ways, he had become the leader I had always hoped he could be, but it had taken losing valuable employees like me for him to understand the cost of his previous behavior. The email concluded with a request that surprised me. Marcus asked if I would be willing to speak with some of the current employees at Harrison Industries, particularly those who were early in their careers and might benefit from hearing about my experiences and the lessons I had learned. He wanted to create a speaker series focused on professional development and leadership, and he thought my perspective on overcoming workplace challenges would be valuable for others who might find themselves in similar situations. I agreed to his request, not because I had forgiven him completely, but because I recognized the opportunity to turn a painful experience into something that might help others. The speaking engagement turned out to be one of the most rewarding professional experiences I'd had in years. The audience was engaged and thoughtful, asking questions that showed they were grappling with their own workplace challenges and looking for strategies to navigate difficult relationships and toxic dynamics. After my presentation, Several people approached me privately to share their own experiences and thank me for speaking openly about the realities of workplace politics and professional adversity. One young woman, a recent graduate who had been struggling with a difficult manager, told me that my story had given her the courage to have an honest conversation with her supervisor about their working relationship. Another employee, a mid-level manager who had been considering leaving the company, said that hearing about the changes Marcus had made gave him hope that the culture was genuinely improving. The experience reminded me that sometimes our worst professional moments can become the foundation for our most meaningful contributions. The skills I developed in dealing with Marcus's behavior, resilience, strategic thinking, clear communication, and the ability to maintain professionalism under pressure had made me a better leader and a more effective mentor. The painful lessons I learned about toxic workplace dynamics had given me insights that I could share with others who were facing similar challenges. As I drove back to Portland after the speaking engagement, I reflected on how much had changed since that terrible night at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. Marcus had evolved from an antagonist into someone who was actively working to create the kind of workplace culture that would prevent others from experiencing what I had gone through. Daniel had demonstrated that even the most difficult family and business situations could be navigated with integrity and fairness. And I had discovered that sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is refuse to accept treatment that diminishes your worth, even when the cost of that refusal seems impossibly high. The story of my conflict with Marcus and my decision to leave Harrison Industries had become something larger than either of us had anticipated. It had become a case study in workplace dynamics, a lesson in the importance of speaking up against toxic behavior, and a reminder that true leadership requires the courage to confront difficult truths, even when they involve the people we care about most.